Hello and good day, Prime Minister Trudeau. My name is Jeffrey Ort, and I am an international human and sex trafficking victim. I was brought to your country illegally in April of 2017 and held for 2 years. I was released by my rapists in April of 2019 and subjected to 3 years of the worst failings of the RCMP as outlined by the 2023 Mass Casualty Report. This was done by the Liverpool detachment of the RCMP. The combinations of injuries that I accumulated over this 5-year period produced my 4th terminal medical condition, which resulted in the stroke last September that is ending my life faster than everything else. How this happened is so simple it is a cliche. It is a movie trope. Prime Minister Trudeau, I hope you've kept up with the messages, as there isn't time to explain or unpack anything moving forward. My declining health from fatal injuries worse than the David Reimer situation, cost me the ability to do manual labor in the late 90s, just as my medical community said it would. I switched to international work in the early 2000s, and my declining health over a number of years has cost me the ability to do that work as well. This inconveniently coincided with the death of a Vietnamese student in 2014. I have always been told I would struggle to see 40, and I certainly had, as I was 41 in 2014. In 2015 and 16, I was unable to provide for my full health care needs because of my declining health. My medical community had warned me at 19 that this is how my life would end, that seizures, strokes, and multiple organ failure would kill off my body. It would short-circuit and shut down my organs and my nervous system, but I would keep my mind. My medical community's greatest fear since I was 19 years old has been suicide after prolonged abuse by caregivers at the end of my life, as I will keep my mind while I lose everything else to injuries similar to those seen in Huntington's, Parkinson's, ALS, or aggressive dementia and Alzheimer's sufferers. In 2015 and 16, my health declined faster and faster as I ignored all of these issues. I was obtaining my teaching licenses and welding qualifications, and in my enthusiasm to return to Canada and teach in the IB system, I ignored my declining health. Late in 2016, I moved to Taiwan to bankroll one last job before returning to Canada, but I couldn't pass the medicals. No medicals meant no work permit, no work permit meant no health care. My employers allowed me to work and paid me a portion of my salary under a quasi-legal working status, and I was assured that I would be paid the balance when my health returned and my paperwork was complete. My health only got worse. In March of 2017, I flew to the Philippines for $50 because it was that cheap to travel from Taiwan to the Philippines. I did this so I could use my travel insurance to get medical treatments that I couldn't afford or arrange in Taiwan because of my lack of health care. It was my intention to collect my outstanding salary and return to Canada out of concern for my health overall. I contacted my older sister in early March to lay the groundwork, but also to tell her as little as possible. I was breaking my rapist's oldest rules. I was never to return to Canada, never to ask family for help, and never to explain anything. The Philippines ordered me to a prolonged hospital stay just as Taiwan had. This was for malnutrition, exhaustion, and organ failure that I wouldn't explain to doctors. My employers wouldn't pay me the balance owed because my health hadn't returned and I couldn't complete my contract. I broke all my rapist rules when I wrote my siblings on April 15, 2017 to ask for help and to explain my life. On April 15, 2017, I wrote my 3 sisters, my older sister, my younger sister, and my brother's wife. I wrote them as the heads of the 3 families I was asking for help from. I copied my message to a 4th person, one of my childhood rapists, Roseanne Williams. At the time, she used her mother's name on Facebook. I included Roseanne in this message because she was the only one capable of carrying out the threats that these 3 women had made for the last 40 years. Wilhelmina was 90 and required blood and iron transfusions every 2 weeks. She never left her house except to go to the hospital for her transfusions. Karen was a prescription drug addict since the 80s and was a fentanyl addict of the highest order. She was on a transdermal patch for the maximum dose of fentanyl allowed and she had been that way for over a decade. To demonstrate to Roseanne that I was keeping their rules as best I could, my siblings, having never heard a whisper about my life, never heard about my medical issues, never heard about my employment or my circumstances, my siblings got one vague sentence about each. I told my siblings one sentence about my medical issues. I gave them one sentence about my current health issues and what had happened in Vietnam. I gave them one sentence about why I was in the Philippines, and I gave them one sentence about how much money I needed and what housing I needed, probably in Nova Scotia, while I traveled back and forth from Toronto and Ottawa. And my final sentence was for my rapist, assuring Roseanne that my stay in Canada would be temporary. The shock was instantaneous, and I was met with a flurry of public and private messages from all three of my sisters. That's my older sister, my younger sister, and my brother's wife. Roseanne was included in some of these messages. Facebook notified me each time she read anything she was included in. Roseanne never acknowledged or responded to any of these messages, not even when my sisters messaged her directly with requests for her input or her opinion. Roseanne was furious, as I had put in writing not only vague versions of everything I was told I could never tell my siblings, but I had put in writing repeatedly, as well as stated verbally during Skype sessions, which quickly became the easier way to coordinate with my sisters, that Karen, Roseanne, and Wilhelmina were not welcome. They weren't to be told anything, that Roseanne specifically was not to be told anything I said in private. I named all three women by name repeatedly as the only people that I wouldn't see, speak to, visit, or accept help from. I specifically stated repeatedly that I wouldn't set foot in Roseanne's house if I was in Nova Scotia. My siblings didn't know my reasons, but they understood and accepted my point of view, as no one enjoyed visiting any of these women. They were extremely abusive even when on their best behavior. My siblings admitted that none of them could put together that much cash that quickly, and that even pooled they couldn't put together that much cash that quickly. And they all suggested that since I was asking for my childhood home, which our Uncle Dennis owned, that I should also ask my Uncle Dennis for help. This was unspokenly a very important topic for my siblings, as they had asked me my entire life why I have never asked for Dennis's help in the past, when they all had for decades. Dennis has paid their rent, he's paid for their firewood, he's co-signed student loans in the $70,000 to $80,000 range. He has done everything you could ever imagine to help my siblings, but he's never helped me because I've never asked. And my siblings have always wondered why. My siblings were never told that in 1993 I was threatened with their rape and mutilation and later the destruction of their educations and lives if I ever contacted Dennis or if I ever asked for his help. My two younger sisters, that is my biological younger sister and my brother's wife, they instantly recognized that I had an issue with Roseanne that they weren't aware of, and they never even suggested contacting her for help. My older sister does not pick up on social cues all that well, and the first few times she suggested that she or Roseanne would speak to Dennis, I said no. I was adamant that my older sisters speak to Dennis directly. I asked my siblings repeatedly to only speak with Dennis, to only ask him for help, to only ask him for the money, to only ask him for my childhood home, which he owned. I told all of my sisters repeatedly if there was any problem with Dennis providing the money or the house, they didn't need to explain it. They only needed to tell me that he couldn't help. I told my sisters repeatedly that if Dennis can't help, I don't need to know why. I will just go directly to Ottawa and ask our Uncle Paul for help. He's from my father's side of the family. My sisters assured me many times over that week that Dennis had sent me the money. That money had arrived in the Philippines while I was still there. My sisters assured me many times over that week that Dennis had given me my childhood home while I would travel back and forth to Toronto and Ottawa. I was told many times that Dennis had rescheduled his own birthday party so I could attend before flying to Toronto and Ottawa the first week. I was told many times that he was looking forward to seeing me again, because we had had such a good time looking after Erling Conrad in 2015. Prime Minister Trudeau, it was all lies. My older sister never spoke to my uncle and never told me that she never spoke to my uncle. She never told me that Roseanne was involved. My uncle was never told that I, the child he'd helped raise, was in trouble or sick or needed help. My uncle was never told that I not only asked for money, but that I had come to Nova Scotia to thank him for money that he never sent me. My uncle was never told that I needed medication or a place to stay. He was never told that I came to Nova Scotia to thank him for a home that he didn't actually lend me. Roseanne Williams lied to everyone. She did this to lure me to Nova Scotia, because I had repeatedly stated if the house or the money couldn't come from Dennis, that I would go directly to Ottawa and ask my Uncle Paul for help. Roseanne lied to her brother, my Uncle Dennis, never telling him that I was in trouble. Roseanne lied to my sisters, not only telling them that Dennis had provided the house and money, but telling my older sister some set of lies to stop her from telling me that Roseanne had been involved, to stop my older sister from telling me that she had not in fact ever spoken to Dennis and had gotten the money from Roseanne. Roseanne lied to her mother and sister. They had no idea why I was in Canada again. Wilhelmina in particular was furious. I had been told I was never allowed to return. Roseanne lied to all of her co-workers and that circle of friends, telling them that I had volunteered to live in her house and volunteered to look after her husband. Roseanne lied to the dog trainer who was training her husband's therapy dog. Roseanne lied to that trainer and all of her clients and all of that circle of friends, telling them that I had volunteered to live in her house and to look after her husband. And specifically, Roseanne Williams used the house that is under discussion. She used my childhood home to provide a place for that dog trainer to live and to hold classes. Roseanne had been using that house for months and lied to everyone about Dennis lending it to me. Roseanne spent $5,000 of her own money. She sent her own money to the Philippines, lying to everyone about where it had come from, who had provided it. She did this to lure me to Nova Scotia. She was using my childhood home to groom a dog trainer as another surrogate daughter, as she had done with my younger sister in the 80s and 90s. She never told her brother that I had come to Nova Scotia to thank him for the money he didn't actually send, or to thank him for the house that he didn't actually lend me. Roseanne Williams did all of this to force me to live and work unpaid, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, in her house, to do her housework, to care for her husband because she didn't want to. She's done this many times before to other members of my family when we were children. Roseanne tortured her sister until my siblings and I were almost beaten to death, so that Roseanne didn't have to do her mother's housework in the 80s. Roseanne had had me raped for years so she could threaten her father with doing the same to my siblings, to force her father to give Roseanne my younger sister. My younger sister spent her entire childhood doing Roseanne's housework, raising Roseanne's children, and screaming at me that it was my fault and she wished I was dead so she could come home. Prime Minister Trudeau, on April 22, 2017, I landed at Halifax International Airport and was delayed in immigration as I was not a resident of Canada and hadn't been for more than 2 decades. I was traveling with $10,000 in medication, and the only explanations or instructions were in both Malay and Korean. My older sister picked me up at 3 a.m. My first question, is the old house ready? Can I skip the birthday party and go straight to the old house? My sister's response, I assume so. Roseanne handled all that. That was the first I had learned that I'd been lied to and hand-delivered to my childhood rapist by my siblings. We went to my sister's home to sleep for a few hours. We picked up a week of shelf-stable food and water because my sister still thought I was going to my childhood home, and she didn't know if it still had power or water. She didn't know at that time that Roseanne had been using it since getting the therapy dog for Larry. that a woman periodically lived there, and that Roseanne often held dog training classes there. My older sister drove me to Waves, a restaurant in Bridgewater, Nova Scotia. The next day, the same day, it was April 22nd. We were late for the birthday party supper. Everyone was inside and seated, except for Roseanne. Roseanne was pacing in the parking lot like an animal. I knew instantly Dennis hadn't sent me the money. I knew instantly that Dennis hadn't okayed the house. I knew instantly that Roseanne had lied to everyone to lure me to Nova Scotia because she wanted something. My sister didn't know any of this. She didn't read social cues at the best of times. She had no idea that Roseanne was in a murderous rage, pacing back and forth in front of the restaurant to prevent me from going in. She had no idea that Roseanne was furious because, from Roseanne's point of view, I had made her late, and I had embarrassed her in public before ever arriving in Bridgewater. Roseanne was pacing in the parking lot to get to me before I could thank Dennis, as he would have no idea what I was talking about if I thanked him for money or the house. I let my sister and her daughter go into the restaurant. I stood by the car, putting as much distance between my sister and my rapist as I could. Roseanne only saw this as another power move and was foaming at the mouth, muttering and spitting in anger when she advanced on me. I never left the side of the car until my sister was inside and safe. I spoke first, stepping around Roseanne, telling her that I didn't care what she wanted, I wasn't doing it. Roseanne ran to get in front of me a second time. She dug her claws into my arm, drawing blood the way her mother used to. Roseanne was hissing and spitting and whispering that I would be raped and mutilated on my deathbed the way I was as a child if I dared to tell Dennis anything about why I was in Canada, or money, or the house. I stepped around Roseanne again, growling at her. I don't care what you want. I'm not doing it. Roseanne had to run to get in front of me a third time, digging her nails into the collarbone she knows I shattered in 2012. She was hissing and spitting that I'd be tortured until I killed myself, just like the doctors said I would, if I said a word to Dennis about why I was in Canada or what I'd been promised. I stepped around Roseanne again, growling the same, I don't care what you want. I'm not doing it. Roseanne ran to step in front of me a fourth time, hissing and spitting that Erland's last wish would be destroyed, that Wilhelmina's last wish would be destroyed. It was my grandparents' dying wishes to die in their home, to not spend time in a hospital. And Roseanne was threatening to send Wilhelmina to a hospital. Roseanne was hissing at me that Dennis would hate me for the rest of my life if she had to put Wilhelmina in a hospital. That I was not to dare say one fucking word to Dennis. I stepped around Roseanne again and entered the restaurant. I didn't speak to anyone. It's what my sister expected. I had told her that was my plan, to not see or speak to or engage with anyone that I didn't want to be there. I stopped at Dennis's table to wish him a happy birthday. I told him I was only home for a little bit and had to go to Ontario. I asked him when a good time was to come talk to him. This all occurred on Saturday, April 22nd, and he said Monday morning, but not before 9, because the old woman sleeps in. That would be Wilhelmina. And other than my Aunt Tammy, my Uncle Dennis's partner, I didn't speak to anyone at that supper. At the end of the meal, when everyone was getting ready to leave, I went to the washroom. With my health issues, that was a 15 or 20-minute ordeal. I returned to find everyone gone. I paid for my meal and went outside. Roseanne was again pacing like an animal in the parking lot. She had moved my things from my sister's car to her own. She had brought her husband and her mother to Bridgewater herself, but she sent them home with other family members so that she could be alone with me for the 45-minute drive. It was another 10 minutes of threatening rape and mutilation, starvation, torture, beatings, and suicide, as well as the beating and torture of my Uncle Dennis and the hospitalization of Wilhelmina. It took that to force me into her car. The normally 25-minute drive to Beach Meadows took 45 minutes, as Roseanne would have to slow down to turn and scream at me, as she recounted 4 generations of physical and sexual abuse, including my rape as a child, that she had committed, as evidence of what she would do to get her way. She explained that I was living in her house and looking after her husband for as long as she needed me to. My response at every pause was no. I am too sick for that. I am supposed to be in a hospital. 45 minutes of everything she's ever done to 4 generations of my family, and we arrived at Roseanne's house, not my childhood home. Karen was waiting for us, as she still didn't know why I was in Canada. She had brought Larry home. Roseanne repeated every threat. Everything she'd said to me in the parking lot, everything she'd said to me in the car, she repeated, threatening the rape and torture and murder of Karen's own child to her face. Karen said nothing. Larry was outside walking the dog. Roseanne threatened everything that's ever been done to my family for 4 generations if I didn't agree to live in the house and look after Larry. My response was the same. At every pause for breath, I told her, no, I'm not doing it. I'm too sick. I'm supposed to be in a hospital. It took nearly an hour for Roseanne to get through all of this. And in her growing anger and frustration, in front of her sister, Roseanne threatened to kill Larry, her husband with Huntington's, for the first time, to my knowledge. She threatened to kill him if I left or told anyone what she was doing. She specifically threatened that she would kill him the way he'd almost died in 2016, that starvation had triggered major illnesses, and that she could do it again. In 2016, it was a month of starvation that had caused Larry to develop pneumonia, and that the pneumonia caused a heart attack, and that the heart attack caused a fall, and that the fall had caused a major head injury, and that all told it had resulted in a coma that no one knew if he would wake up from. After an hour, and having my uncle's life threatened, I walked out of the room. I went upstairs to the spare room. I barricaded the door with my grandfather's hospital bed, and I went to sleep because I was severely jet-lagged. Prime Minister Trudeau. On Sunday, April 23, 2017, I woke up in my rapist's house for the first time at 5 in the morning because of jet lag. I packed a day's worth of food and water from what my sister and I had purchased the day before, and I left Roseanne's house. I walked to all my favorite spots in Beach Meadows where I had grown up. I had fires and ate meals on the beach like I had growing up when starvation was the only thing they could do to me. I never saw any member of my family that day. Dennis had said not to come see him until Monday at 9 a.m., so I kept my promise. I came back to Roseanne's house Sunday night while everyone was at a supper that I didn't attend. I went to bed early with jet lag, barricading the door with my grandfather's hospital bed. I was up again at 5 a.m. On April 24, 2017, I had told Roseanne and Karen several times on Saturday that I was asking Dennis for the old house on Monday. I had to wait until 9 a.m. because Dennis had asked me to. I drank coffee and stared out the window until 7 a.m. when I heard Roseanne and Larry both get up. Roseanne taught grade 2 at a local elementary school. I didn't know anything about Larry's health, nothing about his demeanor, nothing about his routines. I heard Larry slump down the stairs, as his Huntington's was severe even back then. I heard him hit the bottom of the stairs, and I heard Roseanne run down the stairs to get in front of him. It's only 20 feet from the bottom of those stairs, through the living room, and into the kitchen, where I had already seen Larry's morning pills. Larry hit the living room and his recliner, which was just inside the door, at 7:25, and he was beaten by Roseanne until 8:10 when she left, screaming that I had made her late for work. He never made it more than a couple of steps into the living room. He never made it more than a couple of steps from that recliner, because Roseanne would shove him backwards, and he would have to catch his balance on the back of the chair. Roseanne beat him with fluidity and ease, with confidence and with practice. She used solid open-hand blows on all the major muscle groups that would be hidden by clothing. She beat him on his arms, she beat him on his legs, she beat him on his chest. She shoved him backwards, forcing him to catch himself on the recliner just inside the living room. In the 45 minutes that I watched this beating, he never made it more than a couple of steps from the recliner. Roseanne repeated everything from the day before, screaming and bragging about 4 generations of physical and sexual abuse, including rape, to get her way. She interjected her beating and screaming with repeatedly screaming at me, "Look at what I have to do. Look at what I have to do to your uncle. Look at what happens to your uncle if you don't do what you're told. You aren't allowed to say no." Roseanne made less frequent and vaguer threats to kill Larry than she had the day before, because Larry was in the room. Over and over for 45 minutes as she worked chronologically through everything she'd done to 4 generations of my family, including the current and ongoing beating of Larry Williams, and everything she would do to me if I left or told anyone. She did this until she was late for work and screamed at me that it was my fault. Prime Minister Trudeau. My Uncle Larry took his pills as soon as Roseanne had left the house. He ate his breakfast and took his dog for a walk around the yard. When I was finished washing his dishes, because he'd asked me to do them, I walked to Wilhelmina's house to speak to my Uncle Dennis. I stepped into the second home of a childhood rapist in as many days. I had coffee with my uncle, and I explained the beating Roseanne had given Larry to Dennis and Wilhelmina. I left vague what she had said during the beating because Dennis doesn't know much about what has been done to my siblings and I. And I asked him simply, how long has this been going on? Dennis said that she's been beating Larry like that since he retired, which would be about 2012. Wilhelmina said that she's been beating Larry like that since her father died, which would be about 2015. Karen showed up shortly before lunch. She never said a word about what she saw or knew from the earlier days. Wilhelmina explained the beating to her and asked her the same question. Karen claimed that Roseanne had beaten Larry like this for as long as they'd been married, if not before, which goes all the way back to the 1980s. Prime Minister Trudeau. It's still April 24th, 2017. I never asked Dennis for the house. I never mentioned the money. Dennis and Wilhelmina didn't know how or why I was in Canada. They didn't know I was sick. They didn't know I was supposed to be in a hospital. I returned to Larry to make his lunch, as he wasn't allowed to cook or clean because of his Huntington's. There was too great a risk of him cutting himself or burning himself. Roseanne was at work all day. She showed up at 3 p.m. and claimed that she was taking Larry for a walk on the beach. She left, and within minutes the phone rang. Wilhelmina was screaming at the top of her lungs that Roseanne was going to kill Dennis, and I could hear the thuds of a much more violent beating in the background of that phone call. I took Larry's truck and rushed down the hill to Wilhelmina's. I could hear the screaming and the beating from across the driveway before I even got out of the truck. I entered the house to find Larry on a stool in the corner, Dennis standing over him, shielding him with his body, while Roseanne beat Dennis on his back and shoulders more viciously than she had beat Larry earlier that day. Roseanne was using closed fists and hammer blows to beat on Dennis's back and shoulders. She stopped when I came in. She took Larry and the dog for the walk on the beach as if nothing had happened. She returned from the beach at 4 p.m. and began another beating until I stood up. She and Larry and the dog were covered in sand from the walk on the beach, and now the kitchen was full of it. Wilhelmina was screaming at Roseanne to go home and clean up. Wilhelmina was screaming at Dennis to clean up the mess that he had just made. Roseanne returned with Larry at 5 o'clock. And when I stepped out of the kitchen to help with a minor part of supper, she beat Larry and Dennis until I stepped back into the kitchen. Roseanne beat Larry with silverware at the dinner table any time I wasn't at the table. If I had to get up, if I had to help someone, if I had to go to the washroom, Larry got beat with silverware at just that meal. When I stepped away to go to the washroom at the end of the meal, she beat Dennis and Larry until I returned to the kitchen. Roseanne beat her husband with Huntington's and her brother on more than 6 occasions that day. She was screaming variations of the same 2 things. When she was beating Larry, she was screaming that he was being beaten for faking his Huntington's to make her look crazy. And she was beating Larry, screaming at him that if he didn't stop faking his Huntington's, she would take all his food away from him. Dennis was being beaten any time I wasn't in the room, as a reminder that he and Larry would get it worse if Jeffrey leaves. That's what she would scream as she beat her brother, that he and Larry would get it worse if Jeffrey leaves, if Dennis helps Jeffrey leave. I was supposed to be in a hospital. I was supposed to be under medical care. I was supposed to be taking all of my normal meds and then some. I was supposed to be on my way to Toronto for interviews. I was supposed to be on my way to Ottawa to set up times to speak to my government about the death of a child in Vietnam. And this Prime Minister Trudeau is only the first 12 hours that I've been in captivity, and my captivity is going to last 2 years. I stopped the beating of Larry at the end of the meal that night by taking him for a drive. Roseanne didn't come home until long after Larry went to bed. Larry was upstairs. He had taken his sleeping pills and his other medications several hours earlier. Roseanne waited until he couldn't be woken by anything. She stood in her kitchen like her mother, and she repeated everything she'd done for the last 24 hours. She screamed at me in chronological order of every physical and sexual abuse she had ever used to get her own way for 4 generations of my family. She screamed about everything she'd done to Larry and Dennis and I just that day. The last thing I heard as I went upstairs was Roseanne standing in her kitchen screaming, "I will kill your fucking uncle if you leave."